Jim, thanks also for the extra hour for my talk tonight. That was a nice... Hey, thanks everybody. Thanks to Jim and Stephanie and Bill and Tussie and all the volunteers at Hamilton. It's my first time at Wayzgoose. It's my first time at the museum. And I've been saying this for the last 3 days. It's overwhelming. I mean, the collection's overwhelming. The people are overwhelming. The event is overwhelming. I mean, I'm not going to be as funny as Gail. There's no chance of that. I'm not going to make the type look as good as Brad. And I'm not going to have stories as good as Carolyn's. I mean, it's just, you get this once in a lifetime, and it's all been here. So thanks for making me part of this. It's really an honor to be in this company. So I design typefaces, and I've been telling people this for the last couple of days, and they always ask whether I make wood type or lead type. And I'm a bit of a carpetbagger. I don't make either. I work digitally. I did get a crack at the pantograph this week. George let me trace this piece of Nick's Brilski typeface and gave me an O because it's hard to screw up. I still managed to, if you look closely, there's a little nick in the bottom. You almost can't see it, but I think of it as a defect. I did get a chance to work with Hamilton on another wood type project though, which got completed last week. I've always loved catchwords, those ands and fors and ofs and thes and things. Bill gave me a chance to update the genre a little bit, so in your goodie bags you'll find some of these that we got to make together. I was told that I can be a little bit saucy with the letterpress crowd. It's okay, so there's some profanity in the talk here and there. There's also a GTFO one. I haven't seen it in person, but it's in some of the bags. Anyway, so I've been making typefaces for 29 years. These are some of the better known ones that many of you use. I've met some people this weekend who've used them on things they've shown me. Starting from the top is Gotham, probably our best known typeface, in large part thanks to this guy. I came to Chicago in 2007 to talk to his campaign people. John Slavic and Scott Thomas had just chosen Gotham for the identity for the Obama campaign. And so I got to see this for a year, which was pretty incredible for people who make typefaces. By the way, it's not just me at the company. There are 20 of us, 6 of them type designers, everybody else in sales and licensing and web development and so on. We've had a couple of chances to work with Obama and his campaigns. In 2012, Blue State Digital decided to add serifs to Gotham to make this logo, and they gave me 75 minutes to redraw the numbers 1 and 2 before things went to press. I got a chance to work with artists for Obama to make a limited edition artwork that sold to raise about $300,000 for the campaign. And there was one truly weird thing, which was this. In 2011, we were building a service to supply web fonts to websites. Obama for America was one of our beta testers, and I was sitting on a beach in Cabo San Lucas with my wife when I checked Twitter, which I should never do, and I learned from Twitter that our web font service had launched, which was odd because it was about 2 years late in development. Obama's people took the site live without telling anybody, so we got 11 million hits in 1 minute. Happily, everything was wired up properly and seemed to work, but it's a good reminder to talk to your clients more often. I forget to do that. The years of the Obama presidency, they used a lot of our typefaces for a variety of things. The website used tons of Gotham, but also Hoefler Text, Requiem, Sentinel, Knockout, Archer, Whitney, Vitesse, Surveyor, and Tungsten from our collection, among the many faces they used from other people as well. Blue State Digital and the communications office, the White House, had a voracious appetite for typography, which was just great to see for everybody in design. These are some of those typefaces and some of our, I guess, less known ones. We have about 1,500 font styles in the library now, and I think someone asked me at dinner what kind of fonts we make, and I said they're pretty conservative on the continuum. We do a lot of text faces and, sans serifs, lots of styles and things. We do a lot of fun stuff too. I tossed this slide in here because I loved the stuff that Brad was showing this morning, and I really want to see like these kinds of two-color things done letterpress. So I'll be, wherever you are in the audience, I'll be finding you to give you some fonts later. If you see me skulking around the last couple of days looking at all the chromatic type at Hamilton, this is why. I love color typography, and some of the best in the world is, 50 yards from where we're sitting right now, as I think you all know. Anyway, I tried to come and not talk about wood type because it's kind of silly for me to be talking about wood type at this hallowed place. But it has a very special place in my life. I didn't grow up with rock and roll or country music or jazz. I didn't grow up watching football or baseball. I didn't see the Grand Canyon until 2 years ago. But the one piece of Americana that's been part of my life since I remember it is wood type. These, of course, are some album covers by Paula Scher. And you said you were tired of seeing Paula Scher's stuff, but throwing it up. When people think about New York in the 70s, they might think about graffiti on subway cars or Studio 54 or whatever. But for me, that entire period was dominated by wood type, a lot of it thanks to Paula, who has explained that one of the reasons she's used so much wood type in her life is that type is cheap. In the 1970s, when there wasn't money for photography and illustration and things like this, you could do a one color or a two color album cover using photostats. I realized, seeing these things growing up, I got the visual joke. These are meant to be newspapers adapted for album covers. And what was amazing to me is that the newspapers I grew up with didn't look like this. I mean, these are the years of USA Today and the Times going to 8 columns or 6 columns. But this still had the visual language of newspapers that I think everybody got. And I loved the idea of that you could use just letters to kind of connote an entire aesthetic in a way that people will understand. When I started working in design in the late 80s, I realized that wood type was a signature of many of my favorite designers. On the left is a poster by Paula Scher, again, kind of recontextualizing constructivism with American type. On the right is a book cover by Louise Feely, and she's using the same typeface in the smallest size that Paula uses in the largest size. This variously named thing that I think they both knew as Gothic 500, but it's got tons of names. That typeface, Best on the left and Franz on the right, had a really important meaning to me as a budding type designer. In the early days of the Macintosh, one of the things I learned from designers like Paula and Louise is that good type doesn't come from the computer, it comes from the culture. And again, this is back in the days when there were 35 digital fonts to work with, and one of them was Zap Dingbats. Not to, harsh on Zap Dingbats, but what Paula and Louise had done and what designers had done for a generation was to collect type specimen books and printed ephemera and use these things as inspiration or literal material for their design work. So I began doing the same. I began collecting type specimens like these, back when you could find them at flea markets and things before eBay made everything too expensive. And it was these kinds of American wood types that were kind of the most inspiring things to me when I started working as a typeface designer. In 1990, I got my first commission to design a typeface for Sports Illustrated, and SI's offices were filled with sports ephemera, boxing posters like this, and this seemed to have the exact kind of flavor they wanted in a new typeface for the magazine. Steve Hoffman, their creative director, commissioned me to make something, and that became Champion Gothic, my first font. Which I'm going to say, it's hard to look at your old work, but I'm taking a note from Gail's book and showing the hits as well. I learned a lot working on this typeface. One thing I learned is that as much as I wanted the typeface to celebrate the kind of charm of wood type, the magazine didn't want a museum piece. There's a nice video about Hamilton on the website where Stephanie talks about the kind of organic quality that wood type has and how when it gets dropped and nicked and develops personality. And that's one of my favorite things about it. What they wanted as a photo magazine in the Time Inc. empire was something slick. And to find a way to kind of bridge these two things in one project was a bit of a challenge. What I realized in working on this project is that I really was interested less in digitizing typefaces than in interpreting them. Taking something that had gone by and thinking how it might be reimagined for some new use. Something else I learned is that beyond even the shapes of wood type alphabets like these is the kind of quality of vernacular American typography that I really love. this is one of those random bits of ephemera that's just kind of comforting and lively and honest. And I think it has something I've been hearing about all day in different ways, which is that kind of frontier mentality of the print shop. The notion that somebody put this together from material they had. There are 3 different sans serifs here. I'm not sure the G is original to the word groceries, but no one cares. It's communicative and it looks great. And this is in the decades before we inherited Helvetica and Universe and the idea of the kind of master planned design system. And to me, it speaks to me in a way that those kinds of things don't. I also learned working in this typeface that fonts need to solve problems. I know designers talk about problem solving all the time. One of the problems they had was that the editors would write headlines at the last possible minute. So the art department would lay out entire layouts, have, you know, headline TK, TK, TK. An editor would come back from a late dinner and a couple of martinis, write a headline that was this long that wouldn't fit into the space, and the art department would redo the entire thing. So we settled on doing a more condensed version of the typeface as well for these very situations. And I think part of the reason that this began to work well is that it actually riffed on an idea from woodtype, the type family that's not arranged in terms of weights and widths, or excuse me, not in terms of weights, but in terms of widths, things being cut in series. And ultimately we made 6 typefaces in the family for all kinds of different headline lengths, and they all follow the same woodtype idea where you jumble together a variety of things that can be used interchangeably without anybody necessarily noticing. So this is the typeface they used for a few years, and they came back a few years later asking for more. We revisited Champion to create the typeface Bill mentioned, Knockout, where Champion came in 6 widths, Knockout was made in 9, and since there aren't really enough standard names for widths, you have condensed and compressed and narrow and so on, I borrowed the weight classes from the professional boxing arena, coming up with a system that nobody remembers except for me and the one boxing geek who works at Sports Illustrated, so that wasn't the best thing to do. But the 2 reasons we did this, one was to offer more widths to work with, a wider range of super narrow and super wide, but something else, which is that they needed more editorial voices. I had gone into the project thinking about the magazine in terms of, you know, stories about Tiger Woods and Michael Jordan and things like that. But I learned quickly, and they learned as designers, that there were other kinds of voices. There are stories about young Olympians in training who suffer devastating setbacks and don't make it to the Olympics. There are stories about finance that change the rules of gambling and how teams can be owned. There are columnists who write satire as well as reportage, and so they needed more typographic voices in the family. So Knockout expanded to be not just a wider range of widths, but weights as well. The ultimate grid was this. It was 32 fonts, which are 9 widths multiplied by 4 weights. And that was 20 years ago, and Knockout has been around since then. I've seen the typeface used for all kinds of circumstances since then, but even with this grid of options, and there was a time when this was the biggest type family we'd done at 32 styles, the one thing it was never intended to do was work in text sizes. So we began about 3 years ago thinking about what we could do there. Text faces have different characteristics from display faces. They need to have larger counters, clearer gestures, a more generous fit. Proportions often change, things like the X height and the ascent and the descent as well. And they need to work on screens, which is where most of us read most of our things these days. This turned into a larger family than expected. We thought we would just kind of dust off Knockout and make a text face. Instead, we decided to rechristen the thing as a new family called Ringside that was finally finished in January of this year. Ringside involved almost all the designers at our studio, 6 of us working on this, most especially Sarah Soskolny, who led the project, and Troy Lenster, one of our designers, who worked on this pretty much hammer and tongs for 2 years. Ringside has some things that Knockout doesn't, like an italic, which was a bit of a fun thing to work on. And it's really kind of the last step in this project that began with a single pair of wood types years and years ago, where Champion had been 6 different styles and Knockout became 32. Ringside ultimately clocks in at 96. There are 6 widths and 8 weights with italics throughout. So with Ringside being adapted from Knockout and Knockout coming from Champion and Champion coming from wood type, there was this kind of risk that we were playing a game of telephone and that maybe the final thing didn't really feel like wood type anymore. And I'm not sure whether it does or not. But what it does have that I like is that kind of frontier mentality, the sense that these might be all different typefaces in somebody's job case that were just thrown together to work well together. They also kind of end up echoing what type used to look like back before the pantograph. The idea that things are cut at different sizes with no real need to look alike from one size to the next. The final note in the Ringside story happened this past January. It was Inauguration Day, of all days, and we were all sitting in the office watching Trump swear the oath of office and not feeling really great about the world, when we saw a new site go live using our web fonts, and it was this. Obama.org launched on that day during the inaugural address, and the new site for the Office of Barack and Michelle Obama debuted as the first to use Ringside. So that was kind of a nice coda for us of having been working with the Obamas for 8 years. Anyway, I didn't want to talk about wood type today because again, it's like bringing Coles to Newcastle to come and speak about wood type here. And I was trying to find projects to discuss that don't involve wood type, and I was coming up empty. I'm really happy that Gail is here this weekend because Gail was one of the first designers I worked for when she was at Rolling Stone in the late 80s and early 90s. Gail and I connected over wood type long before I knew how rare a thing that would be. To meet a professional and be able to geek out about wood type fonts for an hour is something that I don't think has happened since, except probably this weekend. One of the first typefaces that I did for Gail was based on these kinds of faces. This is by Vincent Figgins sometime before 1838, and that inspired a face called Ziggurat, which we did for the magazine. This period in type history, in wood type history especially, is one of my favorites. It's this early 19th century English period where there's this kind of riot of ideas. Everything was a typographic freak designed to be attention-getting. So you see all kinds of really insane out there ideas like this, sans serifs, craziness 200 years ago. I love these. I mean, I love the way that capital M looks like a slab serif M that somebody's taken a saw to. I think it probably was. Gail and I talked about doing some more typefaces for Rolling Stone based on these kinds of things. So Ziggurat inherited a sans serif cousin called Leviathan. And we thought it'd be fun to continue the kind of historical theme and variations and do more things that might be based on the slab serif skeleton. American wood type has no shortage of inspiration for these things. On the left is a Grecian from the, David Shields is here, he can tell me, 1830s page, I think? 1840s. On the right is a Latin, which is actually a metal type here, but it has that same idea of perhaps at heart being a slab serif that's been processed in some way. So we added a Grecian and a Latin to the family and gave those each an italic as well. These aren't italics that have historical precedence, but that's kind of part of the fun of being a type designer is being backed into a dead end and having to design your way out of it. Anyway, I came to talk about things besides wood type, so this is one. We began doing a typeface based on engraved map lettering some years ago. This is a style that cartographers call the stump style, which is a horrible name for such an elegant thing. In the late 90s, I began noodling with something derived from this, which later I did with Tobias Furr-Jones and Jesse Reagan in our office, a typeface called Surveyor. And again, no wood type references. It's entirely based on engraving. And you find these marvelous engraved things on maps that were also very inspiring. And when the typeface was done, I wanted to do something that would be a kind of decorative cousin to Surveyor based on something elaborate. And I found myself looking at wood type again. This is a French wood type from L.J. Pouchet. And I couldn't help but think something like this might work well for Surveyor. I worked with Andy Clymer, one of our designers, on this typeface. And the brief that I gave Andy was to do something that's not overtly antique. Which, Pouchet's type obviously is, but we wouldn't do a typeface covered in laurel leaves or grapes or farm animals or something that's just too 19th century. And we had to also find a way to not draw every single character by hand. The typeface would have 660 glyphs in the Roman, and to do these by hand would be, well, we'd still be doing the ampersand, I think, if we started years ago. Andy had taken a sabbatical to do a thing called the School for Poetic Computing, which is a new kind of 11-week grad school seminar in computational, I'm not even sure what, procedural thinking, and had emerged with all these ideas about ray tracing and fluid dynamics and mathematical models that might work for typography. And hit upon the idea that we might be able to build some scripts that help to adorn the surveyor outlines with something pretty elaborate and pretty handmade. So Andy spent about 6 months writing tools that could create these interesting kinds of lighting effects on letterforms, and together we created this pair of typefaces called Obsidian. That are engraved to look kind of three-dimensional and really do feel like engraved metal or possibly even wood at large sizes. Anyway, I could indeed talk about wood type all night and all the things in type history that I find provocative and inspiring that have to do with wood and foundry type in general. But I think all the good stuff wood type-wise is out there and at home in your shops and basements and so on. So I have indeed found one thing that's utterly unrelated to wood type, although I think I'll be gravitating back to the topic from time to time. 16 years ago this September, I got married at the Botanic Gardens in Brooklyn. And like all designers, I designed my invitations. The invitations are printed, letterpress, of course, by my friend Julie Holcomb in Berkeley. The outer envelopes are addressed by a calligrapher. Everything was coming together beautifully except for the map. This was the map that would show our out-of-town guests how to find the venue and parking and things like that. And I realized that anything set in type seemed too institutional, as if I was making the map for the Botanic Gardens themselves rather than for my wedding. But anything in calligraphy looked ridiculous. I mean, I love calligraphy, but on maps especially, it feels like calligraphy is the province of historical maps or maybe fantasy maps. And as much as Brooklyn is like Mordor, I really wanted to be clear with my guests that I was getting married in a real place. So neither type nor calligraphy seemed to really have the right tone for the project. I wanted the versatility of type. This needed to be an elaborate map that had subways and parking and things like that. And I needed to be able to summon these things from the keyboard rather than lettering them all myself. But I wanted to have the natural, organic feel of something that came from people. Something that wasn't from the institution itself, but was from us and our wedding. So about this time, I got an interesting phone call. Jesse Scheidlauer is a friend of mine who called to ask a piece of typographic advice. Jesse, I think, has the only job that is weirder and more fantastic to civilians than typeface designer. He's a lexicographer. He worked at the OED at the time, and his specialty was colloquial North American English. So he and his team spend their days looking over TV scripts and hip-hop albums and old Usenet posts and trying to find things like the definitive early citation for the phrase BFD, and this is it. Again, I know it's a family place, so I blacked out the offending word. So if you want to know what the F stands for, you're going to have to buy Jesse's book. This is Jesse's book, by the way. It's called The F Word. And it's a dictionary dedicated to the F word and all of its colorful variations. A lot of our conversation about a typeface for the book was about tone. He and his editors wanted something that was casual, insouciant was the word that he used because he's a lexicographer, but also to have a kind of scholastic underpinning. I mean, this is a real dictionary with real scholarship and needed to feel like a proper reference. Dictionaries, I've managed to work this slide into every talk I've given for the last 15 years. Dictionaries are kind of fantastic beasts. I mean, the conversation about tone we had echoed my wedding invitation conversation about what can be casual and serious at the same time, but it raised the question of what could be up to the functional requirements of a dictionary. I think casual readers look at dictionaries and just think, oh, it's set in type. There's incredibly complex stuff happening here, and you all will notice this, but I think most people don't. The use of Romans in italics and headwords that are in a clarendon and two different kinds of superscripts, Greek characters, fraktur characters. This is just one page of a dictionary I happened to have at home when I shot this slide a million years ago. The way they articulate content with lettering is really complex and profound. And what I love about this is it doesn't really require explanation. You don't need to go to the end of the book and realize, oh, you know, the italics are used for the parts of speech. You just get this by experiencing the thing itself. Maps I talk about all the time as well as kind of sophisticated typographic objects. They have their own vocabulary of how letter forms are used. And again, they're often presented to us without a user interface. Spend time with a map like this and you'll get the idea that towns and bodies of water use different kinds of lettering. And these distinctions run deeper still. Take a really close look and you'll see things like this. This is a great tradition in map making from the 1800s in which sites from antiquity are picked out in blackletter. And I love the way a map, I mean, every map has a kind of user interface in the back that tells you which kinds of letters are used for which kinds of things, but they're not really necessary to consult. They kind of educate you about how typography works while you're using them, which I think is just such a great thing. Anyway, like all of the most interesting projects, it seems, Jesse's dictionary didn't have the time to consider a typeface, so I can't even say this aloud almost, they used Comic Sans for the book. They've redesigned the book since then. The second edition is all set in Adobe Caslon and looks kind of like arch and witty, which I like. But I thought the idea was interesting, that there's a need for a typeface that is informational and highly functional, but the seriousness ends there. It's serious in that it can tackle complex information, but not serious in the sense that it's earnest. So this kind of got me thinking about what I could do typographically that could have these qualities. When I began designing typefaces professionally in 1989, I spent a lot of time advocating for custom typography as a way to end the monoculture of digital fonts. An analogy I used a lot was talk about the potential for typography in terms of the abilities of a scribe who could adapt lettering at will. I wasn't thinking just about calligraphy. I mean, there were all those Renaissance writing masters that did these wonderful pyrotechnics of, you know, black letters and chancery italics and things like that. But I was thinking about contemporary artists as well, who use letter forms in a way that is really kind of illustrative. One thing that I loved as a kid, even more than the Wrigley spearmint gum, it seems, and this may be actually one of the reasons I am a type designer today, is the work of Charles Schulz. I think everyone recognizes the iconic lettering of the Peanuts strip, but my absolute favorite part was what happens when Snoopy sits down at the typewriter. And this is just so ingenious. The lettering shifts to something typewriter inspired, and it's funny, and it's unexpected, but it's also really effective. I mean, this signals immediately, this is no longer dialogue or internal thinking, this is typing. I love the way Schulz used different kinds of lettering like this in a very gentle, subliminal way to shade language. And on reflection, I realized that this approach is something that is shared by another favorite artist of mine, Edward Gorey. I don't know if anybody does not know Edward Gorey's work, but if you don't, you're in for a real treat. His stories are great. They're elegant and deeply subversive. They're these marvelous little dark fantasies set in this vaguely Victorian world of like ladies in corsets and men with mustaches and like, you know, Satan sitting right there. And they always seem to involve, you know, people being driven mad or like children being swept down drains. I mean, they're grisly, but they're so excellent. Gorey was a master lettering artist, and I don't just mean lettering in the way that we often use the term to mean these kinds of like, you know, grand gestures. I don't mean his draftsmanship either, which is not the best. It's his perceptiveness about what letters can do, what they can mean. The title pages for his stories always reveal this deep love of lettering in illustrations like this one or this one. And he works different styles of lettering into his work, into the stories themselves, in ways that are always apropos. From the slab serif that signals old-time baseball uniforms to the black letter that identifies this as a proverb. I really loved things like this, the way he would write, and these are all like nonsense stories, by the way. He would always use the vocabulary of typography in his lettering. Use the kind of tropes and cliches of, you know, italics for titles and small caps for attributions and things like that in a way that a graphic designer might. So he was really a keen student of typography in three different ways. He knew what letters looked like, he knew what different kinds of letter forms connoted and knew how typography could articulate content. I think type designers think about these three things in unity all the time, about how we can make typefaces that aren't just interesting but also useful. So lettering was going to be the key to all this talk of tone and content for me. I use lettering every day, not in my role as a designer, but rather in the proofs I exchange with our designers at the office. I have pretty terrible handwriting, I have to confess. And I say this here knowing that there are at least 6 calligraphers in the audience, probably a dozen more. I do often find myself indulging in lettering that's more enthusiastic than it needs to be. There's a direct correlation between how tedious a task is and how elaborate the lettering on it tends to be. This is a kerning proof, which is just like the gun in the mouth part of typeface design. And it's hundreds of pages long, so I'm spending time saying so to the top of this page for Jordan. What I realized though is that even in my kind of crappy lettering, I'm reaching for different kinds of lettering in ways that highlight content in different ways. There's no organizational system here that's especially well thought through, but there's an attempt made to identify different things that shouldn't go unnoticed. So, typeface looking great has been picked out on this open set of capitals. This is a note I sent to Sarah at the office, our senior type designer, who always has nice things to say about my handwriting, which I don't understand because hers is far better than mine. I think perhaps as Edward Gorey, it's less that she likes the lettering, but more likes the idea of having an affection of different kinds of styles and what they can do. You could dissect a note like this and figure out what its recipe is, to say that it's generally set in script and there's some highlights in sans serif small capitals, a sort of wide up here, these decorated inlines, even a pen drawn bold. Oops, gotta go through that all again. There we are. But I think it presents to the reader differently as a kind of single statement that is using noticeable styles the way a typographer might use a bold or an italic for emphasis. And to me, that is what makes handwriting so interesting compared with calligraphy. Calligraphy formalizes its mannerisms and the qualities of its tools and refines them into a kind of particular style, and it can be quite beautiful. But handwriting is far less conscious, and therefore it has the freedom to move between different styles in ways that I think are more interesting and more fluid. And come to think of it, have that kind of frontier mentality of the job case where you just take the typefaces you have and you use them all the way you need to. Style, I think, is incidental to what handwriting is. Handwriting is the record of an author's utterances, and it's only incidentally possessed of style in the way we think about it. And I realized this is what I wanted all those years ago in my wedding invitations and in Jesse's dictionary, something that had the stylelessness of handwriting, but the versatility of a modern type family that could just articulate the information without having to make its style especially clear to anybody. So kind of dissecting this as a brief, I would say that I wanted something that borrowed the best parts of type, calligraphy, and handwriting. I wanted the versatility of type, something I could actually type with, obviously, on the computer, but none of type's artificiality. Type is synthetic. It can be institutional. It can be more anonymous than personal, which as a communications tool is often its strength. Instead of artificiality, I wanted something from calligraphy, which is its organic quality. Calligraphy is genuinely handmade. It's genuinely warm and personal. It's the product of the wrist and the elbow and the shoulder, but it can be too mannered for what I had in mind. I didn't want the Mordor map after all. An antidote to this kind of formality is found in handwriting, which is informal as letters can be. And I love the way handwriting reveals authorship instead of concealing it. But then handwriting can often be disorderly, and if it's mine, it can be pretty sloppy. So what I wondered is there a way to strain out the virtues of these three kinds of lettering and eliminate their shortcomings to make a typeface that is versatile and organic and informal and lose the rest? And that became a typeface called Inkwell, which we published this summer. Inkwell is a weird thing for us. It's not a classic text face. It's not a sans serif in many ways. It doesn't have all kinds of technical pyrotechnics going on. It's an attempt to create a family of typefaces that feels like handwritten text, how you might letter the entire contents of a book if you have the time and the skill and the patience. It began with a set of drawings that I made around 2004, initially as sketches on paper, and then pretty quickly a set of digital fonts as a prototype, to serve as a kind of proof of concept for the idea, to see if this is actually worth undertaking of what I thought might be a much bigger family in the end. I wanted the design to feel authorial, personal, but to have the versatility of a hardworking text face. As much as this is not setting something in Caslon or in Garamond, I wanted to actually function in those kinds of roles. It needed to be able to work small. But I also wanted to have a very expressive set of styles, kinds of recognizable relationships that writers and designers might understand and that might be the equivalent of bold or italic. I also wanted to make sure it wasn't related to a particular typeface. I didn't want to do the hand-lettered Gotham or the hand-lettered Venetian or something else. But just to feel like neatly printed letters that might be separate from these kinds of classifications that we all think about as typographers. So these are some drawings from around 2005 to see how the design might develop. As with handwriting, I found myself reaching for styles that aren't really connected with what a proper typeface might do. You might find things here like the sans serifs happen to be the small caps happen to be sans serifs because I might letter things naturally that way. And that began a whole conversation about whether the typeface should be a serif or a sans serif or both or maybe even more. And I found myself wanting to do more with this than just create a serif or a sans or just both. So I began noodling out some other options as well. This is a black letter, which I thought could be a fun thing to have. I love the black letter. Black letters, and well, I'll reveal my other secret, fetish in a moment, but I love black letter faces. And I love the idea that the typeface could be both Roman and Gothic in the same kind of family, that are related only by being made by the same hand, having that same pen quality. I thought this might go more directions as well, including the kinds of open capitals that my dad used to use. My father was a theatrical set designer and used to letter all of his blueprints in this kind of style. It's an engineer's letter that you'll find on things like patent applications and blueprints, and he used to draw his freehand, but I think they probably came from templates originally like this. Anyway, if the typeface is going to have sans serif letters and then serif letters and then a more rarefied version of the sans in the form of this kind of open, I thought there should be a rarefied version of the serif as well. And so a natural kind of fancy cousin was the Tuscan, which is my other favorite kind of typeface. And by the way, if you guys haven't seen it, there's a two-color chromatic Tuscan on the wall out here called Mexican, made by Page. You've seen it. It's crazy. It's just beautiful. So take a look when you have a chance. Anyway, so Tuscans they do indeed have a wood type thing. So I'm back to the wood type again. I liked this capital H when I made it. The A was kind of a placeholder for a design that might come later. The thought that all these styles could work together, though, reminded me of something else, which is the way that engravers, or Edward Gorey for that matter, could create these kind of riotous collages of letter forms using all these different things together, which felt unified because they came from the same tool. This is George Bickham, of course, on the Universal Penman's engraved frontispiece. And yes, we have a serif Roman, a serif italic, we have a copperplate script and a black letter and all this foo-for-all around it, but they're all made with the same tool. It all feels like it's kind of a piece. And I think that's something that typography can often lack these days. The use of disparate styles that don't feel like a cacophony. This is an example I photographed years ago. I'm seduced by what this piece of type is trying to do, but it's kind of undermined by the divergent typefaces that are being used. I mean, top to bottom, we have a Spencerian script, which is pretty solid, an engraver's letter that's kind of a cousin of the script, I get that. And then we have a classical Roman inscription, which is kind of strange, as rendered by Aldo Novarese in Italy in the 1950s. And there's this Anglo-German Fraktur. I got the feeling that whatever artist made a mock-up of this in pen, the pen version might have been more authentic than the typographic version. So that's what I hoped Inkwell would do. It would unify these kinds of styles with a single common formal vocabulary. So I put the project away in 2006 to focus on other things. Matthew Carter has once commented that he never regrets putting things down and stepping away from them, and I agree. Time confers a valuable perspective that's hard to come by in type design. And exerts an evolutionary force as well to kind of like thin out the herd of bad ideas. But besides time, the other thing that often makes typography better is sharing it. with another designer. And I found the opportunity to do that with Jordan Bell. Jordan is a typeface designer who went to the University of Reading in the UK and joined us 3 years ago. And among other things, I think it's safe to say that Jordan is a kind of compulsive graphomaniac. Every proof I give Jordan comes back covered in notes like these. Some of them are notes to me, others notes to himself, others are just notes for posterity. They're also often pretty funny. This is a note he left underneath a bunch of currency symbols that he was having to redraw. When Jordan started, I put him through a kind of hazing. We did a typeface called Archer around 2001, and 3 years ago decided to expand its range of weights to include some heavier ones, which we gave Jordan the challenge of doing. Making heavier weights of a typeface is demanding enough, but we'd given Archer a set of tabular figures, which are numbers all in the same width. I'm ahead of myself again, sorry. Tabular figures have to have the same width across all the different weights, and even as a typeface normally wants to get wider as it gets heavier, it's constrained by this fixed width system. Jordan had to draw these for these new heavier and heavier weights, so the font gets heavier but doesn't look any narrower, which is a tough thing to pull off. So he came through with flying colors, and we began working on Inkwell together that summer. One thing that you find working with other designers, it kind of forces you to articulate your own position about things. You can't just have mannerisms that you want to render in type. You need to be able to explain what the purpose of the typeface is and what the rule book is. When we began working together in Inkwell, one of our first conversations was about how serifs should connect, and dissecting my drawings to see how they were made produced this kind of recipe for how serifs should be designed in the typeface. And we spent a lot of time trying to abstract from our natural tendencies with a pen what the rules might be, and that created the kind of Bible for the type project, this growing set of guidelines about how strokes intersect and how angles work and things like that. One of the ways we tried to keep things from being monotonous was to apply these strategies in different ways throughout the character set, so that things like caps and small caps don't necessarily look alike. They probably do in type, they probably don't written with a pen. In many ways, Inkwell came about doing the things that you typically don't do in a typeface, since the goal was to make things not just consistent, but varied up to the point where they become noticeable. So I'd had this idea that even though the design was a serif, it should probably have sans serif small caps, because this is how I write. But of course, this means having a secondary set of sans serif caps to go with the serif caps. And we began to feel that trying to build this into the typeface would sort of thwart designers' expectations, or suddenly serifs began vanishing because small caps are being used. So we decided to do both, a serif and a sans. We have a bad tendency of doing the most labor-intensive solution to anything, which I think I can assume you all relate to as printers. Since there was a serif italic, we would need a sans serif italic as well, and it wasn't part of the family I'd explored. I don't tend to write in sans serif italics, but happily Jordan does, and this became one of my favorite parts of the family that he added. It has this real flavor of sign writing that I like a lot. Jordan tends to write from the elbow more than from the wrist, and it's introducing kind of more variety in the type family, which I thought was pretty charming. So this is the typeface as it began to emerge. This is the sans serif italic. I was kind of getting back to the black letter again and again, although I don't know how it will be used by anybody, but it's a fun thing to have. I couldn't stop sketching it. These are some capital sketches in ballpoint pen from years ago. And trying to think about how you might make an informal black letter capital is kind of a fun intellectual puzzle. How you can kind of simplify things to a point where they feel Gothic but aren't quite as elaborate as everything else. Lots of sketches, on restaurant checks and sketchbooks and things. 2 summers ago, I found this really neat iPad application called Notability, which is designed for lawyers to mark up documents. But it uses the Apple Pencil on the iPad Pro, and since it's such a kind of stripped down application, nothing gets between the gesture and the stroke. There's no, it's making a fake airbrush shape or a fake texture with a pencil. It's just, outlines. We spent a lot of time just doing doodles on the iPad and exchanging things back and forth. So these are my drawings for the capitals. And this is the first set of drawings that Jordan did based on these things. So the line quality was a big part of this, as are the constructions for the characters themselves. We took a lot of things that were very antiquated in the Gothic, like this proper black letter N and E, and modernized them so they'd be more readable and more the kind of thing you might write with a pen as well as reading. Part of the fun of a typeface like this is figuring out the back end of the character set. The type designers in the audience here will know what I'm talking about. There are hundreds of characters that you need to draw that no one will necessarily ever even use, but they need to be in there. We had some fun with these. This was pretty great. We did a set of figures for the black letter, which don't really have a historical foundation. And I noticed something strange about these. Like these figures, they look really good. They look they're very consistent. Like what's he done? And Jordan made these into tabular figures, which I think was a kind of like, sticking it to me for the Archer project that I tortured him on. So it's good to know if you do want to set financial data in this typeface, it's got you covered. He's kind of a sick bastard, I thought, but it's I like the result. Anyway, I'm going to wrap things up here. We began thinking about the idea of weight as well. One of the questions that we kept discussing is what kind of tool would make these strokes? Is it a felt tip? Is it a rapidograph? Is it a graffiti marker? And the answer, I guess, should probably be all of the above. We really should do a set of weights for the entire thing. So this is bounded by a pair of extremes, a technical pen thin and a graffiti marker black. So the weights they're pretty useful in the more sober styles, the serif and the serif italic, but they really begin to cook in the black letter. I mean, you got to just love a black letter that's actually that dark and maybe the graffiti marker. We got back to the Tuscan as well and decided that maybe this construction was too complicated and wouldn't work in the heavier weights. I'd spent a lot of time over the years trying to do a Tuscan that would make sense, never quite figured out how they would go. But I was doing some little drawings for logos for the typeface, and I noticed one day that this is kind of Tuscan-like. I mean, it's got those bifurcated serifs in the H, and the O actually has some action going on. Tuscan O's tend to be boring because there are no serifs to put little knobs on. So back to the iPad and began sketching what these letters might look like, and we did this first set of drawings of the Tuscan typeface to go with the whole collection. By last summer, it was feeling like the more of this typeface we drew, the more we would need to draw, which is kind of a bracing change from the normal pattern where you get sick of things, 10% of the way into the project. We got back to the open typeface as well and gave it this set of weights, and really with some nice moments, like when things get this dark and this wide, they're pretty fun. Well, early in the project, I'd worked on the italic and wondered how the italic might pair with the serif Roman or the sans serif Roman. And we began wondering, I mean, should a written italic simply be a script, or should it actually be a lettered italic? I wanted the lettered italic to feel like this sort of Edward Gorey or Charles Schultz typographic thing, but a script felt like a good ingredient to have as well, so we added one. That was the last step in the Inkwell project. This is our first script typeface that we've ever done at the studio after all these years. And to me, one of the fun parts of this is that it's not just a script typeface, it's a script that's part of a type family that's trying to push what type families can do. One of the themes that I find present in type design is that type designers are always advancing the realm of the type family, the perimeter of what type families are. The Aldine italic of 1500 isn't significant just for being a new typeface, but a new kind of typeface. And 30 years later, we have the idea that Romans and italics exist as counterparts in a world for articulating information. Italics are really interesting. The Chicago Manual of Style suggests that you avoid using italics wherever you can, but does kind of confess that some sentences actually do need them to clarify the meaning. The placement of italics in English especially is really important to comprehension. A guy named Victor Galtney is doing a whole dissertation about italics and type, and makes the point that italics are grammatical. They're as important as parts of speech are. You can articulate this same sentence in 6 different ways using italics to some pretty profoundly different meanings. So in the way that type can really aid comprehension and grow the way that information is annotated, I think defends a lot of what's happened in type history. Slab serifs in the 19th century are important for the legacy they had, not just as a style, but as a way of thinking about information. Slab serifs are nice enough, but when they became headwords in dictionaries, we had this new ingredient, this new part of the type family, which was weight. So the typographic family tree is always growing. Robert Bringhurst diagrams it this way, and this is the perspective of a book designer thinking about the way that italics and Romans and bolds and caps and small caps all relate. My hope is that Inkwell might push the definition further in order to better serve both designers and readers. I'm curious to see how Inkwell will get used by designers to articulate information, new kinds of information especially. I was thinking, oops, I've done it again. I'll take a break and have a little sip of water. I was thinking about information that isn't bookish, but is familiar to all of us, like Wikipedia. We read a lot of things like this these days that don't make a lot of use of type. I mean, Wikipedia uses italics and bolds, but it doesn't really use typography to assist readers beyond that. Nothing distinguishes between an article like this, a history page like this, or commentary like this. And these are three different kinds of message that really can be shaped by typography. Imagine for a moment that instead of using the same typeface for articles and past versions and commentary, you had a type family that had these built-in associations that might mean writing and old stuff and notes. And for that matter, what if the architecture and the internal links had different typography as well? What if we used a sans serif to mean this is what the page is made of versus this is what the content is? I prepared this slide for another lecture I gave a few months ago and mentioned to the designer Barbara Glauber that I was using Wikipedia as an example. And she said, oh, you should just do Wikipedia in Inkwell and see what it looks like. So I thought I would try that. I'm not sure it's for everybody, but I think it's a fun exercise. I like the idea, though, that you can use one typeface that suggests something printed, another that suggests something written. This is the commentary. And finally, the history page, which looks like this, something out of the past. And you can really go to town on the history page, by the way, and do all the typefaces at once if you want to. So I would love to see this personally in Wikipedia. But I'll settle in the meantime for seeing the typefaces used somewhere else, perhaps a dictionary, and perhaps even a map for somebody's wedding. Thank you all very much. Yeah, of course.
Yeah, thank you.
So I'm going to use the additional hour for questions, right? That's how we're doing this?
Yeah, for sure.
Okay, great.
Can we just go back to the slide of the map for the wedding? It was just up for a second.
Sure.
I just wanted him to go back to the slide of a wedding map for a second.
Oh, just to see it.
Oh, okay.
Sorry.
Okay, so in case anybody's curious, this is a real nerdy moment, but this is a fake map. I mean, this is not a place that exists in the world anywhere. We spend a lot of time doing art for our website, and this is an example from that, of things that are plausible uses of our typefaces, but we try not to use actual names of people or products or places as, obviously to either offend or bother or confuse anybody. So this is a synthesis of 3 different regions in England with as many names cut off as possible, so they're missing. And Jordan also asked me to point out that the little church and house icons are not part of the typeface. We drew those just for this one little thing.
So this is a weird question because it's for you and for you. The first time I came to Hamilton in the old museum, I saw a list of what appeared to be like a donor wall that was names carved forward right reading, which was weird, on the wall by the type specimens. And your name was there, but you said you've never been here before.
No.
So then, how did your name get on the wall, and why?
Well, we've supported the museum since its foundation. I mean...
Yay!
I'm just sorry I haven't made it out sooner.
All right, I got one. So, your love of history and your fanatic research. Who are you looking at today? Who excites you as your fellow typographers, letterers, calligraphers? Can you give some shout-outs?
There are so many people doing good work today. I mean, it's funny. It's like from time to time we'll get an email from some like large font outfit, and we'll say like, they're ripping off our art. We did the same art last month. But I kind of realized like I got into this because I wanted type to not vanish and to be better. And so when that happens, I'm like, well, you know, mission accomplished, I guess. I don't know. I mean, there are so many designers working in the States and in Europe, especially today. I think there's a lot of interesting work happening in the non-Latin sector. A lot of Reading grads doing things in the Arab world, especially. Doing a lot of typefaces for the Indian languages, the Devanagari alphabet, especially. Gosh. I think a lot of technology is driving type as well. There are people who are involved in font tools doing type design and doing things in new formats that are really eye-opening. And I think, like what I was saying about the way families tend to grow, a lot of the things they're going to do are going to help define what type can do in the coming century, probably, beyond just what typefaces look like today.
I know this isn't financially practical, but there's a lot of new ways to cut type now, and letterpress people are interested in it. There's photopolymer to make type that has, and flexography is a huge industry of its own. Laser cutting, laser engraving, CNC routing. It's not financially practical to make the photopolymer flavor, or version, but have you thought about, are people, do you know of type designers or interns coming through who are looking at creating weights that are particularly designed to be cut or printed after being cut?
Not that I know, I'm not in my studio. We've done typefaces that are designed with photopolymer plates in mind, but that's plates, that's not type. But I'd be curious to know what kinds of use cases there are that might drive type design. I'm seeing some rumblings happening in the front row. Yeah, I'd love to learn more about it. I mean, if there are things that people want to do, let's chat, because I'd love to see these things.
Have you done anything in a non-Latin language?
No. We've done some Greeks and Cyrillics, but that's as close to Latin as it gets.
I have a question. So in 2008, I was working as a grassroots organizer and on campaigns, and I didn't do anything related to graphic design or printing. And 10 years later, my life has completely changed. But the Obama campaign's visual language was really instrumental in my shifting of thinking. So thank you.
It's not me. I mean, it's entirely the campaign.
Yeah, no, I mean, but the way that it was interpreted by Shepard Fairey, by artists, the campaign's initial use of it and identifying Gotham as a vehicle, and then how it, in popular culture, then filtered down and was used by printers in a very social democratic way. I mean, it really changed how I thought about design. So I'm just curious if you have thoughts about Gotham's role in that, and also in general nowadays design's power and the role of how printed text looks to inspire movements and to spark change.
Yeah. It's funny. I mean, one of my closest friends has worked in, he's had two simultaneous careers for the last 30 years. He does editorial design and works in city politics in New York. And so he's always got going back and forth between like a magazine gig and working for a city council candidate. And like clockwork, every campaign he does, he comes asking for typefaces, and I propose a bunch of stuff. And no matter what I propose, he's like, that's too edgy. And it doesn't matter what the typeface is, it's like knockout, it's like too edgy. I'm like, it's a basement design 160 years old, it's not edgy. It is the most, I'm not edgy, nothing I make is edgy. But after Obama, he stopped saying that. It's like, any typeface will do. And I mean, I think that campaign certainly shook up, it made design a important component in communications in a way that a lot of clients didn't recognize, political clients especially. I will say that the other edge of the knife, though, is, I don't have a picture of this, I wish I did, or maybe I probably shouldn't. I've been asked for years if I have a least favorite example of my fonts out in the world, and I don't, or I didn't until the Republican convention this year, where Trump was Trump in Gotham, in gold, of course, like 20 feet high. what works for one candidate works for another, and you begin to see candidates on both sides of the political spectrum using the same typography. At least they've settled on what red and blue mean. I mean, the typefaces are still for everybody. You've seen social democrats using Gotham, you've seen nationalists using Gotham, you've seen candidates in other countries using typefaces that are Gotham-like, that support their script systems. There's a candidate in Israel 3 years ago who was running on a kind of nationalist agenda using a typeface that was this very bold, engineered-looking sans serif with blue fades in the background and all that kind of stuff. So, and that's the kind of the lot of a typographer in general. You don't have control over how things get used, and it can be a little bit disturbing sometimes. But, I will say that one nice thing we do get to see is organizations making typography a bigger part of their communications where they wouldn't otherwise have normally done so. The Southern Poverty Law Center is a client of ours. They use tons of our typefaces. Yeah, they do outstanding work. Russell Estes is their art director, and he's terrific. The Natural Resources Defense Council uses our typefaces. Oceana uses them. The Anti-Violence Project uses them. We are really, really happy to see our things being used for socially progressive causes whenever we can, and facilitate that whenever we can as well. So, yeah, I'm happy to see people get that design can be a force, because it really is. We all know this, but now, everyone else is figuring it out too.
We just wanted to say that we think the little churches and houses could be part of a font called Inkwell Dingbats. Alternate name.
Inkbats.
That I like. That may happen this year. I'll put that out there. Sources point to yes.
Earlier today, we heard in a talk that typographers no longer exist as a job. I don't know whether it's true or not, but do type designers think of themselves as typographers?
I don't know. We should ask them. They're all. I get one no. Mark? Two no's. I do all the typography for our company as well as working with the type designers, so I'm a typographer in that capacity, but I think we all know that type designer means making the fonts, typographer means using the fonts. But I'm not sure that I agree that typographers don't exist anymore. I'm not sure that compositors exist anymore, but somebody is setting all this type, and it's not just books, it's not just packaging. There's a realm of shaping content that happens with people who actually know how type works, so I'm not sure.
Jonathan, I'm curious, as a designer of type, do you ever reach a saturation point with seeing your work kind of come back to you in other forums, or does it always feel like a discovery of how somebody else has used those materials?
I don't know. I always like seeing it used, except when it's used anachronistically in a movie. That always gets me when it's yeah, this is Mark's department. You're still doing your blog about that, right, Mark? Because that's, yeah. I hope you get back to it. Yeah, the city street in Venice in 1490 using Gotham is or any lettering at all, let alone a typeface. Yeah, that's kind of my Achilles heel, but beyond that, it's all good.
One more question.
You talked a little bit about how type design, one of its drivers is popular culture. And I was wondering if, in addition to some of the more Americana things you put up there, or some of the advertising, if you could, off the top of your head, maybe think of some other vernacular sources that have been instrumental in type design.
For me personally, I've personally been going through kind of mid-century Italian thing for the last 10 years. Typefaces like Vitesse and Forza and Tungsten, a new one called Peristyle we did last month. Those all kind of have a Nebbiolo feeling to them. But that's also kind of historical. I like to look outside of history as well and think about what kinds of things that we might pigeonhole as being historical maybe aren't. What kinds of things have happened that we can say, well, the obsidian typeface is a good example. This is this incredibly elaborate ornamented thing that I wanted to have the kind of exuberance of a Victorian typeface, but not to be Victorian. That's kind of an angle that I find very fertile to think about in terms of in both old and new typography at once. Am I good? Thank you again.
We're going to take a 5-minute break before the type quiz begins, so go and relieve yourselves if necessary. But before you go, I want to direct your attention to this lovely carving to our right here. JP, increase the lighting on it. That's Big Bertha from the Inquirer collection, and we've got some historical music to go along with it. So take a break. We'll see you back here in 5 minutes for the type quiz.
Bertha Butt, one of the Butt sisters. He didn't care. He looked up, he said, "Suck it to me, suck 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 it to me." She looked down on him. She started to crush it, but she began to like it. And she said, "I'll suck it to you, Daddy." He said, "What?" She said, "I'll suck it to you, Daddy." You know what he said? He started it all way back then. I ain't gonna lie to you. When she said, "I'll suck it to you, Daddy," he looked up, he said, "Right on, right on, hot pants, yeah. Right on."
Check, check, check. Check. 1, 2. Check, check. 1, 2, 1, 2. Check, check. 1, 2. 1, 2, 1, 2.